"I have known since the first morning," he said quietly, and the words fell into the silence between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Sadie Quinn thought she understood about the last 6 months of her life. She stood in the doorway of the small clapboard house at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, her travel bag dropped at her feet, her fingers gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The evening light was burning copper and orange behind Clement Donnelly's broad shoulders, casting him in silhouette, and she could not read his face properly, could not tell if what lived in his voice was confession or condemnation. "Known what?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Rower. Clement, what have you known?" He turned away from the window. The amber lamplight caught the hard line of his jaw, the deep shadows under his eyes that told her he had not slept, maybe not for days. His hat was on the table beside him and he had not picked it up. That alone frightened her. Clement Donnelly was never without his hat. It was the first thing he put on in the morning and the last thing he set aside at night. And the fact that it sat untouched on that rough pine table, while he stood bareheaded and stripped of every careful defense he had ever built, told her this was not a small thing. This was the thing. The secret thing. The hidden truth he had been carrying since the morning she first arrived in Caldwell on the southbound train from Wichita, stepping off onto the platform with red dust on her boots and a forged letter of recommendation in her bag. "I knew who you were," he said. "From the very first morning. I knew your name before you told it to me. I knew about your father, about the warrant." The word warrant hit her like a slap. She pressed her back against the doorframe. "Then why?" she started. "Because I made a choice," he said. "And every single day after that first morning I kept making it. I kept choosing you, Sadie." She did not speak. She could not. The whole elaborate architecture of her new life in Caldwell, the careful disguise she had maintained for 6 months, the trust she had slowly and painfully built, every piece of it suddenly looked different. Not necessarily ruined, but transformed, revealed as something she had not fully understood from the inside. She had to know everything. She had to go back to the beginning. It had started, as most dangerous things do, on an ordinary morning in late April of 1883. Sadie Quinn had been 24 years old, traveling under the name Sarah Cooper, carrying nothing of value except a second-hand carpetbag and a bone-deep determination to disappear. She had grown up in Dodge City, the daughter of a man named Robert Quinn who had been many things in his life, not all of them admirable. He had run a gambling operation out of the back room of a dry goods store for 11 years before the law had finally taken sufficient notice, and by the time the federal marshal came calling in February of 1883, Robert Quinn was 3 weeks dead of a chest infection, leaving behind debts, a bad reputation, and a daughter who had managed to stay clean of his business dealings, but could not prove it to anyone who mattered. The warrant had not been for Sadie directly. It had been issued for anyone in possession of ledger books belonging to Robert Quinn's operation, books that allegedly contained evidence of a larger criminal network stretching from Dodge City to Wichita, involving men with political connections and very long memories. Sadie had those ledger books. She had taken them from her father's desk the night he died, not because she was protecting any criminal enterprise, but because she had read them and understood that the names inside them would get her killed if the wrong people found out she had seen them. So she had run. She had gone south toward the Oklahoma border, and then doubled back north toward Caldwell, which sat right on the border of Kansas and the Indian Territory, and was at that moment one of the most chaotic cattle towns in the American West. Caldwell in the spring of 1883 was a place where a person could get lost if they were careful, where strangers arrived by the dozen every week and questions about a person's past were considered poor manners. She had arrived on a Tuesday morning when the cattle pens near the depot were full, and the streets were loud with drovers and traders and the constant movement of commerce. She had gotten off the train with the dust of the journey on her coat and had walked directly into the nearest establishment that might offer employment, which had been the Meridian Hotel on Main Street, a two-story wooden building with a wide porch and a sign in the window advertising for a bookkeeper. The hotel was owned and operated by a woman named Martha Finch, who was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, and entirely without patience for foolishness. She had looked Sadie up and down in the entryway with the expression of a woman who had seen every variety of hard luck story and was not particularly moved by any of them. "You have experience with accounts?" Martha had asked. "Yes, ma'am," Sadie had said, which was true. She had kept her father's legitimate accounts, the actual dry goods inventory, for 5 years. "References." Sadie had produced the letter. Martha had read it, folded it, handed it back, and said, "I'll want to see your work before I trust your references." Then she had hired her on a trial basis at $12 a month plus room and board, and Sadie Quinn had exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 months. She had not noticed Clement Donnelly that first day. Or rather, she had noticed him the way one notices furniture, as a presence in the background of a room, necessary and unremarkable. He had been sitting at the far end of the hotel's front porch when she arrived, tipped back in a chair, reading a newspaper, and the only reason she had even registered him was that he was very still in a way that felt deliberate rather than lazy. Most men she had known were either in aggressive motion or collapsed in genuine exhaustion. This man was neither. He was watchful in a way that should have alarmed her. It did not alarm her. That was the part she would think about later. He was 30 years old. She would learn this eventually, the same way she would learn everything else about him, in pieces, over time, like a landscape that only resolves itself as you walk through it. He was the deputy sheriff of Caldwell, serving under a man named Sheriff Thomas Olds, who was a competent if unimaginative lawman primarily concerned with keeping the cattle trade moving through the town without excessive bloodshed. Clement did much of the actual work of that project, the mediation of disputes, the quiet management of dangerous men, the thankless business of being the person who stood between order and chaos in a border town that sometimes seemed to exist for the express purpose of testing such distinctions. He was not a flashy man. He did not swagger. He wore a plain brown coat and kept his badge polished but not ostentatious, and his gun was a .45 caliber Colt single-action Army revolver that he wore at his hip with the particular ease of someone who had carried one so long he had stopped being conscious of it. He was not handsome in any obvious way, but he had a face that rewarded attention, with dark eyes that were unexpectedly warm when they were not being professionally careful, and a mouth that seemed to be considering a smile far more often than it actually produced one. Sadie had learned his name from Martha Finch on her second day, when he had come through the hotel lobby to speak with Martha about an arrangement concerning the safety of the hotel's cash deposits. Some regular discussion about the frequency of his evening patrols past the building. Martha had introduced them with the perfunctory courtesy of someone who assumes 2 adults can manage their own social arithmetic, and had then gone back to her office, leaving Sadie standing behind the front desk with a ledger open in front of her, and Clement Donnelly looking at her from across the polished wood counter. "You're the new bookkeeper," he had said. "I am," she had said. He had nodded with that almost smile that lived at the corners of his mouth. "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Cooper." And that had been the entirety of their first conversation. He had tipped his hat and gone out through the front door into the bright Kansas morning, and Sadie had looked down at her ledger and felt, unaccountably, as if something important had just happened. She had told herself it was anxiety, paranoia, the natural hypervigilance of a woman with a secret. She had gone back to work. What she had not known, could not have known, was that Clement Donnelly had received a telegram the previous day from a colleague in Wichita, a man named Marshall Frank Derry, advising him that a young woman named Sadie Quinn might be heading south toward Caldwell, that she was believed to be in possession of evidence material to a federal investigation, and that if she arrived in his jurisdiction he should detain her and hold her for the marshal's arrival. He had read that telegram 3 times. He had folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his coat. He had then walked to the Meridian Hotel on his regular morning rounds and seen a young woman with brown hair and tired eyes step off the southbound train with a carpet bag and a forged letter of recommendation, and a look on her face that was not the look of a criminal. It was the look of someone who was terrified and exhausted and trying very hard not to show it. He had made a decision in the space of about 45 seconds. He had not telegraphed Marshal Derry that the woman had arrived. This decision had not been made carelessly. Clement Donnelly was not a man who made careless decisions about the law, having spent 8 years in various roles of law enforcement in Kansas, and having seen what happened to places where the law was casually disregarded. He was not romantic about outlaws. He had no patience for men who broke rules and called it freedom. He believed in order with the same quiet conviction that some men reserved for religion. But he had also, in those 8 years, seen the law used badly. He had seen warrants issued on the basis of the convenience of powerful men, rather than the guilt of accused ones. He had seen women caught in the machinery of their fathers' or husbands' crimes and ground down by it without mercy or nuance. And something about the specific combination of Frank Derry's name on the telegram, the political dimensions of the Quinn investigation, and the particular quality of the fear in Sadie's eyes when she stepped off that train had made him slow down and think before acting. He had written back to Frank Derry that same afternoon. He had said the woman had not yet arrived in Caldwell to his knowledge, but that he would continue to monitor the situation. Then he had gone about his business and watched and waited and tried to figure out what the truth was. This was not, it should be said, an emotionally neutral process. From the very first morning he had made that choice to wait and watch rather than act. Clement had been aware of a particular quality to his attention when it was directed at Sadie Quinn. It was not merely professional interest. It was the kind of attention that had a warmth in it, a pull, something that made him find reasons to pass through the Meridian Hotel lobby with slightly more frequency than his normal rounds strictly required. He told himself this was diligence, investigation, the necessity of keeping a careful eye on a person of interest in a federal matter. He was not entirely convincing to himself. The weeks passed. May moved into June and June moved into July, and Sadie Quinn, working as Sarah Cooper, proved herself to be an excellent bookkeeper, a quiet and self-sufficient tenant, and a woman who inspired genuine affection in Martha Finch, which was no small accomplishment given that Martha Finch did not inspire easy affection in anyone. Sadie worked carefully, ate her meals with the other hotel staff, took long walks along the edge of town in the early evenings when the heat permitted, and appeared to have no criminal connections whatsoever. Clement watched all of this. He also, slowly and somewhat against his better judgment, began to talk to her. It had started with small things. A question about whether she had settled in comfortably. A remark about the heat. The ordinary social maintenance of a man who encountered the same woman regularly in the course of his daily rounds. But somewhere in the middle of June, without Clement being entirely able to identify the moment it happened, the small talk had become real talk, and the real talk had become something that he found himself looking forward to in a way that complicated his sense of professional propriety considerably. She was funny. That had been one of the first things he discovered, unexpected and a little undoing. Not obviously funny, not the kind of humor that announced itself, but dry and quick, and with a particular quality of noticing things that other people missed. She would say one sentence about something she had observed, delivered perfectly flatly, and he would find himself biting down on a laugh. He had not laughed easily for a long time before that summer. She was also, he discovered as the weeks passed, angry. Not in a way that was ugly or destructive, but in a way that felt earned and honest, an anger at the particular unfairness of her situation that she had distilled into something more like determination. She did not talk about her past directly. She never slipped in the ways he half expected someone maintaining a false identity to slip. But occasionally, in the midst of a conversation about something else entirely, he would catch a flash of something in her face that told him she was thinking about what she had left behind and what had been done to her in the process of the leaving, and that she was not yet finished being angry about it. He found this entirely admirable. He was not sure what to do with that finding. In early July, there was an incident that changed the texture of things between them. A group of drovers had arrived in Caldwell at the end of a long cattle drive from Texas, as happened regularly throughout the summer months, and 3 of them had gotten into a dispute at the saloon 2 doors down from the Meridian Hotel that had spilled out onto the street, with enough noise and violence to alarm everyone within hearing distance. Clement had intervened, along with his fellow deputy, a man named Pete Harlan, and had managed the situation with his usual combination of calm authority and the credible implied threat of a man who clearly knew exactly what he was doing with the revolver at his hip. Sadie had been on the hotel porch when it happened. She had watched the whole thing from the top of the porch steps, and afterward, when the drovers had been dispersed and the street had returned to its normal noise level, Clement had looked up and found her standing there, and something in the way she was looking at him had made him stop walking. "You are very good at that," she had said. "It mostly comes down to seeming confident," he had said. "Mostly," she had echoed, with a tone that told him she understood the difference between seeming and being. He had climbed the porch steps. It had been a warm evening, the kind where the air still held the day's heat long after the sun had dropped, and the main street of Caldwell was loud with the commerce and energy of a town living at full pitch. But the porch of the Meridian had been quiet in the way that a small shelter from a storm is quiet, and they had stood there together for nearly an hour, talking about nothing in particular and about many things that mattered, and somewhere in the middle of that hour Clement Donnelly had accepted the thing he had been resisting since April. He was in love with her, not falling toward it, not edging up on it. In it, fully, inconveniently, entirely in it. This created a problem of considerable magnitude, because the woman he was in love with was a woman he had been concealing from federal authorities for 10 weeks, and he still did not fully know what she had done or not done, or what she was carrying in that carpetbag that the marshal in Wichita was apparently willing to spend significant resources to recover. He spent most of July working up the nerve to ask her. He did not manage it until the first week of August, which was not his finest hour in terms of professional efficiency, but which at least had the advantage of their having established enough real trust by then that the conversation had a fighting chance of being honest. He found her one evening after supper, sitting in the small garden behind the hotel where Martha Finch grew tomatoes and kitchen herbs, reading one of the penny novels that she borrowed from the dry goods store and returned every week with careful punctuality. The garden was shaded by a single cottonwood tree that caught the last light of the day in its leaves, and Sadie was sitting in the old wooden chair that Martha kept out there, her shoes off, her feet in the grass, and she looked so entirely at ease that he almost turned around and went away again. He did not. He sat down on the upturned crate that served as a second seat in the garden, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as me talking to you, not as the law talking to you. Can you do that?" She had closed her book. She had looked at him with an expression that was very still. "That depends on what you say next." "I know your name," he said. "Your real name, Sadie Quinn. I received a telegram about you in April, the day before you arrived." The silence that followed this was one of the longer silences Clement had ever sat through, and he had sat through some considerable ones in his professional life. "And yet," she said finally. "And yet," he agreed. "Why?" she asked. It was a one-word question that contained about 17 different questions inside it, and Clement tried to answer all of them honestly, or at least as honestly as a man can manage when the honest answer includes the admission that he had made a significant professional compromise based partly on emotional instinct. He told her about the telegram. He told her about Frank Derry, whose reputation in Wichita law enforcement circles was of a man who was thorough and competent, and not particularly troubled by the difference between justice and convenience when powerful men needed a favor. He told her that something about the shape of the warrant, specifically the fact that it targeted anyone in possession of the ledger books rather than anyone who had actually committed a crime, had struck him as wrong from the beginning. He told her that he had watched her for 10 weeks and had seen no evidence of criminality and considerable evidence of a woman trying to build something clean out of the wreckage of a bad situation she had not made. He did not tell her about the hour on the porch in July. That was information for another time, if there was another time. She listened to all of this without moving, with that particular quality of stillness that he had come to associate with her processing something important. When he finished, she was quiet for another long moment, and then she said, "I have the ledger books. They're in my room, inside the lining of my carpet bag." "I figured," he said. "The names in them," she said, "include a state senator, 2 land agents, a man in the federal marshal's office in Wichita." She paused. "A man named Frank Derry." Clement went very still. "My father knew for years," she said. "He kept the books as insurance. I took them when he died because I knew if anyone else found them first, I would not survive being the person who had read them. And then the warrant came, and I understood that Derry already knew I had them, and that the warrant was not about justice. It was about retrieval." Clement looked at her for a long moment in the fading light of the August evening, sitting in Martha Finch's garden with the cottonwood rustling softly overhead, and he said, "What do you want to do?" She blinked. He had the impression she had not been asked that question in quite some time. "I want to stay here," she said. "I want to keep working and stop running. I want those books to become someone else's problem, someone clean enough to actually use them for what they contain." She looked at him steadily. "And I want to not be afraid anymore." He nodded slowly. He was already thinking, the professional part of his mind beginning to turn over the problem with the same methodical care he brought to everything. But the larger part of him was simply present in that garden with her, in the early evening of an August day in Kansas, watching her be brave and honest and tired and fierce, and thinking that he would do whatever it took. "All right," he said. "I know a federal judge in Wichita who is not on that list. His name is Arthur Caldwell, and he is the most irritating man I have ever had dinner with, but he is clean. If we can get those books to him directly, bypassing Derry, there is a real chance this becomes something other than a noose around your neck." She exhaled. It was the same exhale he had seen her take on that first morning when Martha Finch hired her, that specific exhalation of relief that a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time. "You would do that?" she asked. "I already decided to do it," he said, "in April. You didn't know any of this in April." "No," he admitted, "but I knew enough." There was a pause. "What did you know?" she asked quietly. And he looked at her in the garden in the last light and said simply, "That you were worth the risk." She looked away at that, into the middle distance where the tomato plants were growing in their neat rows, and he could see the emotion moving across her face that she was not yet ready to let him see directly. He did not press. He had learned over the weeks of watching her that she needed room to land. What followed that conversation was 3 weeks of very careful, very dangerous work that required Clement to operate on 2 simultaneous tracks, maintaining his normal daily duties in Caldwell, while quietly sending communications to Judge Arthur Caldwell in Wichita through a postal route that bypassed the channels Frank Derry would be monitoring. He also had to manage the continued existence of Sadie in Caldwell without triggering Derry's suspicion, which meant responding to the occasional telegram from Wichita with vague assurances that investigations were ongoing and no definitive identification had been made. This elaborate deception was not comfortable for him. He had spent his adult life on the side of straightforwardness and had a genuine moral allergy to dishonesty. But he had made his assessment of what was just in this specific situation, and he was committed to it, even as the strain of maintaining it wore on him in ways he felt in his sleep and in the set of his shoulders, and in the particular tightness around his eyes that Pete Harlan mentioned one morning while they were doing their rounds. "You look like a man carrying a heavy load," Pete had said. "I am," Clement had said, and Pete, who was a good deputy and a perceptive one, had looked at him for a moment, and then nodded and not asked any further questions. Sadie, for her part, had not been passive during this period. She had copied out a precise and annotated summary of the most critical entries in the ledger books, creating a document that could be understood by a judge even without the full context of the original records. And she had done this work late at night in her room with the kind of focused precision that suggested she had been planning something like it for a long time and had simply needed someone to plan it with. She brought the summary to Clement one morning, and he had read it at the desk in the sheriff's office with the door closed. And when he looked up from the last page, his expression had been grim and certain. "This is enough," he had said. "This is more than enough. Derry is finished the moment this reaches Caldwell." She had stood on the other side of his desk, watching him. "Are you sure about this?" she had asked. "Once this goes forward, there is no going back. Derry will know it was you who helped me." "I know," he said. "It could cost you your position, your reputation." "I know that, too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to know that I understand what you are risking. I need you to know I don't take it lightly." "I know you don't," he said. And then, because it seemed like the honest thing to do, and because the 3 weeks of shared risk and late evenings going over documents, and the particular intimacy of trusting someone with the full truth of your most dangerous secret, had stripped away the last of his professional distance, he said, "I'd risk considerably more than my position, Sadie." She had looked at him then with the full force of her attention, and the expression on her face was something he had not seen there before, something open and unguarded and a little stunned. She had not said anything, but she had not looked away either. Judge Arthur Caldwell received the package in the last week of August. He was, as Clement had described, a deeply irritating man, prickly and formal and absolutely tenacious, once he had fastened onto a legal matter of genuine substance. He had the summary and Clement's covering letter in his hands for less than 4 hours before he had drafted an emergency warrant for the arrest of Frank Derry and 2 associated parties, and had dispatched his own federal officers, men he trusted personally, with copies of the full documentation. Frank Derry was arrested on September 4, 1883, in his office in Wichita, while in the middle of eating his lunch. The news reached Caldwell by telegram the following morning, and Clement had been in the hotel lobby when it arrived, speaking to Martha about some minor matter, and Sadie had been behind the front desk, and he had handed her the telegram without saying anything, and she had read it twice, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them. "It's over," she said. "Almost," he said. "The warrant on you will need to be formally withdrawn. That will take another few weeks, but yes, the dangerous part is over." Martha Finch, who had observed this entire exchange with the sharp attention of a woman who had been watching 2 people try not to be in love with each other for months, and had found the spectacle both endearing and mildly exasperating, said from her position near the window, "I'll put on coffee." The formal withdrawal of the warrant for Sadie Quinn came through in early October. Judge Caldwell's office sent a letter confirming that the investigation had established that she had been in possession of the ledger books as an uninvolved party seeking to preserve evidence rather than to obstruct justice, and that she was cleared of any suspicion in the matter. The letter was addressed to Sadie Quinn at the Meridian Hotel in Caldwell, Kansas, which meant that her real name and her real address were now officially connected in a way that could not harm her. She read the letter sitting at the front desk on a Tuesday morning when the hotel was quiet, and when she finished reading it, she sat very still for a long moment, and then she did the thing that Clement, who was sitting in the chair across the lobby because he had not been able to be anywhere else that morning, had not expected. She laughed, a full, genuine, unburdened laugh that filled the quiet lobby and seemed to come from somewhere so deep and so long suppressed that it surprised even her. He watched her laugh and felt something shift in him the way a foundation settles, something settling into permanent rightness. He proposed to her that evening on the porch of the Meridian Hotel, in the chair where they had talked through that summer evening in July, and he did it with a simplicity that was very characteristic of him. No elaborate speech, no excessive preamble, just the direct statement of a direct man who had decided he was done waiting to say the true thing. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "If you're willing, and if you're not willing at this particular moment, I'd like to ask again in 6 months or however long you need." She was quiet for a moment. "Clement," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've been in love with you since July," she said. "I'd like to not spend any more time pretending otherwise." He took her hand on the porch of the Meridian Hotel in the early October evening while the cattle town of Caldwell moved around them in its perpetual noise and motion, and he held it carefully, as if she was something worth holding carefully, which she was. They were married in November of 1883 by the Methodist minister who served the Caldwell congregation, in a small ceremony in the church on 2nd Street that was attended by Martha Finch, Pete Harlan, Sheriff Thomas Olds and his wife, and a collection of townspeople who had watched the two of them circle each other through a long summer and had found the eventual resolution deeply satisfying. Sadie wore a blue wool dress that she had bought at the dry goods store 3 weeks before and altered herself in her room in the evenings after work. And Clement wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and had his boots polished to a degree that Pete Harlan had noted was unprecedented. They moved into the small clapboard house at the edge of town that Clement had been renting for 2 years, a 3-room structure with a porch that faced east and caught the morning light. And Sadie hung curtains at the windows and put her books on the shelf that Clement built for her against the parlor wall. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she woke up in the morning without the particular weight of concealment pressing on her chest. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was a cold one in southern Kansas, with heavy snow in January that kept the town quiet for days at a stretch. During those quiet days, Sadie and Clement discovered the particular pleasure of being snowbound with the right person. They read by the fire in the evenings, Sadie with her novels and Clement with the legal texts. He studied with the deliberate purpose of a man who was thinking about the direction of his career. They argued occasionally, with the specific productive heat of two people who are both sharp and direct and not afraid of the friction, and made up with the particular thoroughness of two people who understand that the connection is more important than the position. They cooked together on Sunday mornings, a domestic ritual that neither of them had expected to find as nourishing as they did, Clement handling the actual heat of the stove with the pragmatic competence he brought to most physical tasks, while Sadie managed the precision elements of baking with the same attention to detail she had always brought to accounts. In March of 1884, Sadie told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, having made coffee, and then stood there with the cup in her hands for several minutes working out how to say it. And when she finally said it, he had been very still for a moment, and then he had crossed the kitchen and taken her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and had said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" In the particular order of a man whose first instinct was for her well-being before his own emotion, which was characteristic of him and which she loved. "I feel fine," she said. "I feel wonderful, actually. I feel like things are exactly as they should be." Their son was born in November of 1884, exactly 1 year after their wedding. They named him Thomas Robert Donnelly, the first name for Sheriff Olds, who had been a quiet supporter of Clement's through the events of the previous year, and the middle name for Sadie's father, a complicated tribute to a complicated man who had, whatever his failures, loved his daughter in his way. Thomas Robert Donnelly arrived in the world on a Tuesday, in the bedroom of the clapboard house at the edge of Caldwell, with the assistance of the town's doctor and Martha Finch, who had appointed herself necessary to the proceedings and had not been wrong. He was a healthy, loud infant with dark hair like his father, and a quality of stubborn determination that Clement, watching him navigate his first hour in the world, found entirely familiar. Clement had sat beside the bed afterward, holding his wife's hand, watching his son sleep in the cradle that he had built over the summer in the evenings after work, and he had felt the full weight of the year behind them, every choice and risk and moment of genuine fear, and had understood it all to have been perfectly, exactly worth it. By this time, Clement had been offered and accepted the position of sheriff. Thomas Olds had retired at the end of the summer, citing his age and his wife's desire to move to her sister's property in Missouri, and had recommended Clement to the town council without hesitation. The council had agreed with the same unanimity. Clement had been sheriff of Caldwell for 4 months by the time his son was born, and the badge sat a little differently on his coat than the deputy's star had, carrying more weight and a different kind of responsibility, but he wore it with the same quiet steadiness he had always brought to the work. Sadie had returned to working with Martha Finch after a few months, not as a live-in bookkeeper, but as a part-time accountant managing the hotel's increasingly complex finances, a role that suited her temperament and her practical need for occupation that used her intelligence properly. She was also, as the spring of 1885 arrived, beginning to think about what might come next for them in terms of Caldwell's civic life, which was growing and changing rapidly as the cattle trade evolved, and the town's character shifted from purely transient to something more permanently settled. There was a school building project being discussed in the town council that spring, the question of whether Caldwell had sufficient permanent population to justify a dedicated schoolhouse, rather than the informal arrangements that had been serving the town's children to date. Sadie had attended one of the public meetings on the subject, initially just as an interested resident, and had ended up contributing to the discussion with a level of practical financial analysis about construction costs and ongoing operational requirements that had visibly impressed the council members, and had resulted in her being informally consulted on subsequent questions. "You should stand for the school board when they constitute it," Clement had said that evening over supper. "Women don't stand for boards," she had said. "You reorganized Martha's entire account system and identified 2 years of billing errors that she recovered," he had said. "You saved those ledger books and used them to bring down a corrupt federal official. I think you can manage the Caldwell School Board." She had looked at him across the supper table with little Thomas in his chair between them making determined attempts on his mashed potatoes, and she had thought that she had somehow, despite everything, ended up in exactly the right life with exactly the right person, and the force of that realization was not lesser for being the 100th time she had felt it. If anything, it accumulated, getting stronger with each repetition rather than dimming through familiarity. "I'll think about it," she had said. She had stood for the school board. She had been elected, with the support of Martha Finch's vocal campaigning and Clement's steady endorsement, and the goodwill she had built in Caldwell over 2 years of being honest and useful and genuinely present in the life of the town. She had served with the particular combination of rigorous practicality and deep investment in the actual welfare of children that characterized her approach to everything she cared about. The schoolhouse was built in the summer of 1885, a proper clapboard building on the east side of town with 4 windows and a bell. At the dedication ceremony in August, Sadie stood beside Clement on the steps of the new building with Thomas on her hip, and she looked at the building and thought about the girl who had stepped off the southbound train in April of 1883 with a forged letter and a carpetbag full of dangerous evidence, afraid and alone, and convinced that all she could hope for was not being caught. Then, and this was the part she wanted to make sure she got right in her understanding of it, there had been a morning. A specific morning. The first morning, as she now thought of it, when a man with watchful eyes and a barely suppressed smile had looked at her across a hotel lobby and said, "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Cooper," and she had felt, underneath the anxiety and the exhaustion and the particular loneliness of a disguised life, the faintest and most unexpected warmth. And now here they were. Which brings us back to the evening in the small clapboard house. The evening that had seemed like the end of something but had turned out to be the beginning of the real conversation. The one they had somehow never quite had in full, even as they had built an entire life together around its edges. Sadie had come home late that evening from a school board meeting that had run longer than expected, a tense debate about the hiring of a second teacher that had required careful navigation. She had been tired when she came through the door, and she had found Clement sitting in the parlor without the lamp lit, which was unusual enough to stop her in the doorway, hand still on the frame. He had been holding a letter. She could see it in the low light, a single sheet of paper in his hand, and his expression had been the careful, closed expression he wore when he was managing something difficult. "What is that?" she had asked. He had looked up. And then he had said the words that had hit her like that stone dropped in water. "I have known since the first morning," he said quietly, and she had asked what he had known. What she had not yet known, standing in that doorway, was that the letter in his hand was from Judge Caldwell's office in Wichita. It was a notification that Frank Derry, despite his conviction and imprisonment, had managed through his remaining connections to file a civil complaint against Clement Donnelly specifically, alleging that Clement had withheld information from a federal investigation and thereby obstructed justice. The complaint was almost certainly without legal merit, Caldwell's letter said, but it would require Clement to respond formally and potentially appear before a review board in Wichita, and depending on how the political winds were blowing, it could create difficulty for his current position. The darkness of his expression when she had arrived was not, as she had initially feared, the expression of a man who had discovered a betrayal or uncovered some new secret. It was the expression of a man who had just been reminded that the choices he had made on a Tuesday morning in April of 1883 still had weight and consequence, and who was sitting in the dark trying to decide whether he regretted them. She had understood all of this in the 60 seconds between his confession of knowing since that first morning and her asking what he had known, and in those 60 seconds she had felt a particular terror, not of the legal situation, which she already knew they could navigate together, but of the possibility that she had cost him something he should not have had to pay. He told her about the letter. She crossed the room and took the letter from his hand and read it while he watched her face. "Clement," she said when she had finished. "I'm not sorry," he said immediately. "I want to be very clear about that. I have never once been sorry for any of it." "I know," she said. "I know you're not." She sat down beside him on the settee and put the letter on the table and took his hand. "But I am that you have to deal with this because of me." "Because of Derry," he said firmly. "Not because of you. Because of choices you made for me. Choices I made because they were right," he said. "The fact that they were also, very importantly, for you is something I will always be glad of, but the fundamental choice was about what was right." He looked at her in the low light of the unlamped parlor. "You know I don't do things for the wrong reasons." "I know," she said softly. "And I knew," he said, "from the first morning, not the whole story. I didn't know about Derry or the full scope of it. But I knew that you were in a situation that was not of your making, and I knew that you deserved someone who would slow down and think before acting. That was what I knew, and I made my choice from that knowledge." She was quiet beside him for a long moment, holding his hand in the unlighted parlor with the Kansas night pressing gently against the windows and the distant sound of the town carrying through the walls. "And every morning after that?" she asked. "Every morning after that," he said, "I knew something more, and it kept being the right choice. It kept being more right every single morning, not less." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "We will answer the review board," she said, "together, and Caldwell will support you because he knows the truth of it. And Derry is already in prison, so his complaint has the weight of spite and nothing else." She paused. "And if they try to take your badge, we will fight that too." "I know," he said. "I'm not done being angry about the things that were done to us," she said. He made a small sound that was the laugh she had learned to listen for in him, the one that lived very quietly and meant more than the loud ones. "I know that too," he said. The review board convened in Wichita in November of 1885, exactly 2 years after their wedding. Clement and Sadie made the journey together by train, leaving Thomas in the care of Martha Finch, who had accepted the assignment with the resignation of a woman who secretly loved being needed. Judge Caldwell testified on Clement's behalf with the tenacious precision of a man who found legal injustice genuinely offensive, and the documentation of Frank Derry's own corruption was entered into the record, and the review board deliberated for less than 1 day before ruling in Clement's favor, noting that his actions had in fact served the interests of justice rather than obstructing them, and that the complaint was without merit. They were in their hotel room in Wichita when the ruling came through, and Sadie had read the letter from the board's chairman while standing near the window, and when she finished, she had set it down on the dresser with great care and had stood very still for a moment, and then turned and crossed the room to where Clement was sitting in the chair by the door and had put her arms around him and held on. He held her back, both arms, the way he had always held things he cared about, with complete intention. "It's finished," she said into his shoulder. "It is," he said. "All of it," she said. "All the parts that were wrong, all the things that were done to us that were not right. It is all finished now." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Yes," he said. They went home to Caldwell on the southbound train, the same direction that had brought Sadie into this town and this life. And when they stepped off the platform, Thomas Robert Donnelly, who was just past his first birthday and had recently become mobile with an enthusiasm that suggested he was not going to be a cautious person, was waiting in Martha Finch's arms and reached immediately for his mother with both hands, and the loud, imperative vocalization of a child who considered his parents' absence a personal affront. Sadie took him and held him against her and looked over his dark-haired head at the main street of Caldwell, which was in its full autumn state, the air sharp and clear, the cottonwood trees at the edge of town showing gold, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a person standing inside the life they have built and finding it sound. Clement picked up their travel bag in one hand and put his other hand briefly at the small of her back as they walked off the platform, and Martha walked beside them, already telling them everything that had happened in town while they were away: a collapsed fence at the cattle pen, and a dispute between two merchants about a property line, and a delivery of new fabrics at the dry goods store that Martha felt Sadie should know about immediately. Life in Caldwell in the years that followed settled into the kind of rhythm that looks from the outside like ordinary life and feels from the inside like an ongoing gift. Clement served as sheriff with a reputation that grew steadily, not in the flashy direction of some frontier lawmen whose names ended up in the papers for acts of dramatic violence, but in the quieter direction of genuine civic reliability. Caldwell was changing, growing from a raw cattle town toward something more permanent and structured as the nature of the cattle trade itself evolved, and more families settled in the area, and Clement's style of law enforcement, measured and thoughtful and built on relationship and trust rather than fear, suited the town's direction perfectly. In the spring of 1887, Sadie became pregnant with their second child. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or at least she felt more contained within it, less frightened by the unfamiliar processes of her own body, and she continued to work with Martha and to serve on the school board up until the last month, when physical practicality required some modifications to her schedule. Their second child was a girl, born in December of 1887, and they named her Clara Jane Donnelly. Clara arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, being apparently a child of efficient and deliberate dispositions from the very beginning, and she had her mother's brown eyes and her father's particular quality of watchful attention, taking in the world around her from her earliest days with a focused consideration that made the people who met her feel, a little oddly, like they were being assessed. Thomas, who was 3 years old at the time of his sister's arrival, and had understood himself to be the primary object of everyone's attention until that point, required some adjustment to the new arrangement. He went through approximately 2 weeks of vigorous protest, conducted largely through the medium of refusing to eat his supper, and then apparently made his peace with the situation and appointed himself Clara's primary guardian, a role he took with a seriousness that was both touching and faintly comic given his age. With 2 children and a household and Clement's increased responsibilities as sheriff, and Sadie's growing role in the town's civic development, their life had become genuinely full in a way that required active management. They managed it together with the particular competence of 2 people who were genuinely compatible in the organizational sense as well as every other sense, their respective strengths complementing each other in ways that made the whole more efficient and more comfortable than either of them could have managed alone. Sadie had a particular skill for strategy and planning, for seeing the shape of a problem in full and mapping the route through it. Clement had a particular skill for execution and presence, for being exactly and completely where he needed to be when he needed to be there, without wasted motion. Together they navigated the daily logistics of their life with a smoothness that occasionally prompted Martha Finch to observe, with a mixture of approval and something that might have been wistfulness, that they were unusually well suited to each other. "You say it like it's a surprise," Sadie had said once. "I say it like it's something to be careful with," Martha had said. "Good things need to be looked after." She was right about that, and Sadie had taken it seriously, as she took all useful truths seriously. On their 5th wedding anniversary in November of 1888, Clement brought home a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he placed on the supper table after the children were in bed. Inside was a copy of a book of poetry that Sadie had mentioned once, very briefly in passing, that she had read as a girl in her father's house and had never been able to find again since. He had been in correspondence with a bookseller in Kansas City for 3 months to locate it. She held the book and looked at him across the table and said, "How long have you been looking for this?" "Since July," he said. "That's almost 5 months." "I know." She opened the book carefully. Inside the front cover he had written, in his precise, deliberate hand, the words that she kept for the rest of her life as a piece of evidence that she had been exactly as loved as she had hoped to be. He had written for Sadie Donnelly, "I have known since the first morning. I will know every morning after this one." She read it twice. She looked up at him with the full force of what she felt, unguarded and complete, and she said, "I knew too, if it matters. I just needed longer to admit it." "It matters enormously," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she gave it to him, and they sat in the quiet kitchen of the small clapboard house at the edge of Caldwell, while the November wind moved around the walls outside, and the lamp burned steady between them and their children slept in the back rooms, and they were as completely and unambiguously happy as 2 people are allowed to be. The spring of 1890 brought changes to Caldwell that had been building for some years. The cattle trade had shifted significantly with the expansion of the railroad and the changing economics of Western ranching, and the particular wild energy of the cattle drive town was gradually giving way to something more settled. Many of the establishments that had catered to the seasonal influx of drovers were closing or converting to other purposes. New businesses oriented toward permanent residents were opening in their place. The raw frontier character that had made Caldwell what it was in its heyday was receding, and something different was taking its place. Clement had been tracking this shift with the attention of a man who understood that his role would need to evolve with the town's character, and he had been in correspondence with several people about the question of what law enforcement in a more settled Kansas community would look like. He had also, in the way of a man who thought carefully about the future, begun to consider whether his skills might eventually be better applied in a different direction entirely, whether the legal training he had been pursuing informally for years might at some point translate into something formal. He had raised this with Sadie on a Sunday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and the children outside in the yard where Thomas, now 5, was conducting some kind of important project involving sticks and a bucket of water, and Clara, who was 2 and had very definite views about everything, was supervising it with great earnestness. "I've been thinking about reading for the law formally," he said. "There's a lawyer in Wichita named Parsons who has offered to take me as a clerk. It would mean some time in Wichita, possibly significant time." Sadie had looked at him over her coffee cup. "When did this offer come?" "Last month." "You've been thinking about it for a month." "I have." "And what have you decided?" "I haven't," he said. "It's not just my decision." She had set down her cup and looked out the kitchen window at their children in the yard, at Thomas's stick architecture and Clara's earnest oversight, and she had thought about what she wanted and what was possible and what Clement needed, which she had become very good at thinking about accurately over 7 years of shared life. "I think you should do it," she said. "It would mean changes," he said. "Significant ones. We'd likely need to spend real time in Wichita. The children would need a different school eventually." "Martha Finch is not going to approve of us leaving Caldwell," Sadie noted. "Martha Finch would never say so." "Martha Finch wouldn't need to say so. She would simply arrange circumstances in ways that made leaving feel unnecessarily complicated." He had smiled at that, the full smile, not the almost smile, and she had felt it the way she always felt it, like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. "But she would understand," Sadie continued, "because she knows that people grow and that growth sometimes requires movement. And she loves you. She loves us both. She would want this for you." "For us," he said. "For us," she agreed. They had gone to tell Martha that afternoon. Martha had listened with the expression of a woman receiving news she had already partly prepared herself for, and she had said, "Well, Wichita is not the moon. We'll see each other still." And then she had said, briskly and before the moment could become sentimental, that she needed to start thinking about a proper replacement bookkeeper, and would Sadie train someone before they left. They moved to Wichita in the summer of 1890. It was a different kind of life than Caldwell, larger and faster and more complex, and both Clement and Sadie spent the first months learning its different rhythms. Thomas started school in September and returned each afternoon with the particular energized overstimulation of a child who had found his intellectual match in a proper classroom. And Clara, who was nearly 3, occupied herself with the elaborate social organization of the children in their new neighborhood with a diplomatic skill that her parents found both amusing and entirely unsurprising. Clement worked in Parsons' law office with the same steady diligence he had brought to every other professional undertaking, and the law, which he had been thinking about informally for years, opened out before him with the particular satisfaction of a subject that turns out to fit the shape of a mind perfectly. He had a gift for it that Parsons recognized and commented on with the directness of a man who did not waste compliments. Sadie found work relatively quickly with a mercantile firm that needed someone capable of managing their accounts with real precision, and the larger scale of the Wichita commercial world offered scope for her abilities in ways that Caldwell had not always been able to. She was also, quietly and with great deliberateness, writing. She had started writing in the evenings after the children were in bed, initially just as a way of ordering her own thoughts about the past 7 years, the journey from Dodge City and the forged letter, and the terrible loneliness of the disguised life, through to everything that had been built in Caldwell. But the writing had grown into something more purposeful, a documented account of the corruption she had witnessed and survived, the machinery of powerful men using the law as a tool for personal interest, and the specific experience of being a woman caught in that machinery with no legitimate institutional recourse. She was not sure what it would become, whether a formal submission to some publication or simply a record for her children, but the act of writing it felt important, and she pursued it with care. On a warm September evening in 1891, sitting at the desk in their Wichita house with the window open to the evening air, she finished it. She put down her pen and read back through the last page and then sat for a long moment in the lamplight, thinking about everything the pages contained, all the fear and the running and the weight of secrecy, and then the morning in a hotel lobby and the evenings on a porch, and a man who had made a choice. She took the finished manuscript to the Kansas City Star, which had been running a series of articles on corruption in Western law enforcement that suggested an editorial sympathy for exactly the kind of account she had written. The editor there, a sharp and energetic man named Franklin, read it in 2 sittings and made her an offer immediately. It was published in installments in the winter of 1891, under her full name, Sadie Quinn Donnelly, and it generated a response that neither she nor Clement had quite anticipated, not just within Kansas but more broadly, in the conversations happening in various parts of the country about the relationship between law and justice in the Western Territories. Clement, when she showed him the first published installment, had been quiet for a moment and then had said, "Your father would have been proud of you, the actual you, the person you chose to be." She had not been able to speak for a moment at that. "He was not entirely a bad man," she had said finally. "No," Clement had agreed. He wasn't. By 1893, Clement had been admitted to the bar. He had passed the examination with results that prompted Parsons to say, with the grudging admiration of a man who prided himself on understatement, that Clement was the most capable law student he had encountered in 30 years of practice, which was not the most effusive praise imaginable, but from Parsons was essentially a sonnet. He opened his own practice in the spring of 1893, in a rented office on Douglas Avenue in Wichita, with a hand-lettered sign on the window that read Clement Donnelly, attorney at law. Sadie had been there when the sign went up, standing on the sidewalk in her best coat with Clara on one side and Thomas on the other, and she had looked at the sign and felt a particular kind of pride that was entirely pure, nothing complicated in it, just the clean satisfaction of watching someone you love become what they were always capable of being. "How does it feel?" she had asked him. "Terrifying," he had said. "Exactly right." "Good," she had said. "That means you're doing the right thing." He had laughed and taken her hand, and they had all gone inside the new office together, the 4 of them moving through the empty rooms with their particular family noise, Thomas asking immediate practical questions about the filing system, and Clara investigating each corner with the methodical attention she brought to all new spaces, and Clement and Sadie standing in the middle of it all, in the middle of the life they had built from a Tuesday morning and a telegram and a choice. In 1894, their 3rd child was born, another boy, whom they named Henry Clement Donnelly, known from his earliest days as Hal. Hal arrived with considerable speed and personal enthusiasm, the midwife having barely established herself in the bedroom before he was emphatically present, and he continued in this fashion for the entirety of his early childhood, approaching the world with an urgency and energy that kept both his parents in a state of pleasantly exhausting alertness. Thomas, who was 10 and had developed into a quietly serious child with a passion for mathematics and a tendency to read at the supper table if not actively redirected, received his new brother with the formal courtesy of someone welcoming a new colleague. Clara, who was 6 and had the social confidence of someone 3 times her age, appointed herself Hal's primary interpreter to the world, and took to this role with the same decisive competence she applied to everything. Clement's law practice grew steadily through the latter years of the 1890s, taking on cases that often had at their center the same questions that had defined his and Sadie's story: the relationship between institutional power and individual justice, the particular vulnerabilities of people caught between laws made by powerful men, and the realities of ordinary life on the frontier. He represented homesteaders in land disputes, workers in wage cases, and on several occasions women navigating legal situations in which the existing framework provided them very little protection and required creative advocacy to find any purchase at all. He was not a famous lawyer. He was not particularly interested in fame. He was consistently, carefully, thoroughly effective, and his clients tended to find him through the recommendation of other people who had found him effective. Sadie's written work had continued after the publication of the 1891 account. She had written 3 more substantial pieces for various publications over the following years, and had contributed to a collection of writings on women's legal standing in the territories that had been circulated in connection with the various suffrage discussions of the period. She had also taken on a part-time position teaching bookkeeping at a commercial school that had opened in Wichita in 1895, which she found unexpectedly absorbing, the particular satisfaction of passing on practical tools to young women who needed them. Martha Finch came to visit in the summer of 1896, traveling up from Caldwell on the train with a trunk of preserves and the same brusque energy she had always had, and she spent 2 weeks in their house on Maple Street being simultaneously deeply critical of the Wichita climate, deeply admiring of the children, and openly emotional about Clement and Sadie's life in ways she would not have admitted to if questioned. On her last evening, sitting in the parlor after supper while the children slept, and the summer night was warm through the open windows, Martha had looked at the 2 of them with the expression she had always worn when she was about to say something true and didn't want to be thanked for it. "You were both such serious, careful, worried people when I met you," she had said. "Both of you, terribly cautious in different ways. It's nice to see what happens when that kind of caution finally lets go." "We haven't entirely let go," Sadie had said. "We are both still quite cautious." "No," Martha had said firmly. "You're careful about things that deserve care. That's different. Caution that comes from fear is not the same as care that comes from love." She had taken the train back to Caldwell the following morning, and Sadie had watched the train pull away from the station with the particular feeling that always accompanied Martha's visits, the sense of being seen clearly and found acceptable by someone whose judgment she trusted. Thomas Donnelly turned 15 in 1899, tall and quiet and precise, already expressing a strong interest in engineering that his father found admirable, and his mother found both admirable and faintly amusing given how thoroughly it diverged from either of their own proclivities. Clara was 11, already running complicated small-scale domestic and social operations, with an efficiency that made both her parents think she was going to do significant things eventually. Hal was 5, loud and loving and seemingly determined to climb every vertical surface in Wichita. On the last day of the 19th century, New Year's Eve of 1899, Clement and Sadie sat on the porch of the Maple Street house after the children were in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the town celebrating the turn of the millennium. The night was cold and clear, the stars very sharp above Wichita, and they were wrapped in blankets in the 2 chairs Sadie had dragged out to the porch over Clement's practical objections, and he had his arm around her because practicality had its limits. 17 years ago I had never heard of Caldwell, Kansas, she said. 17 years ago I had never read a telegram that changed everything, he said. Did you know that day that it would change everything? He thought about it with the honesty he brought to such questions, the real answer rather than the satisfying one. "No," he said. "I knew it was a decision. I knew I was making a choice rather than simply following procedure. But I didn't know where it went from there." "When did you know?" she asked, not for the first time, but she liked the answer. "The first morning," he said. "Not the full knowing, not the way I know now, but the beginning of it, the morning you stepped off that train." She looked out at the cold Kansas night. "I was terrified that morning." "I know," he said. "You were terrified and you still walked straight to the nearest door that might offer something. That was when I knew." She turned to look at him. In the lamplight through the window, He looked the same to her in all the essential ways as the man who had sat in a garden chair in August of 1883 and said all rights in the tone of a person who had already made up his mind, and also completely different, changed by 16 years of life and work and children, and the particular changes that come from being genuinely known by another person. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the first morning. I will love you every morning after this one." The new century arrived in noise and celebration, and the particular hope that comes with the turning of a great marker of time. They stayed on the porch until they heard the town's church bells ring midnight, and then they went inside and checked on their sleeping children, all three in their rooms, Thomas's long feet hanging off the end of his bed, Clara with her book fallen open on the pillow beside her, Hal sprawled in the glorious boneless abandon of a small child's sleep. And then they went to bed themselves in the house they had made together, and the new century began. In the years that followed, the world changed in ways that no one in Caldwell in 1883 could have fully anticipated. The automobile appeared and then proliferated. The distances that had defined frontier life began to collapse in ways that made the raw wildness of the 1880s feel, not long afterward, like something from a different age entirely. Kansas settled. The frontier closed. The cattle drives that had made Caldwell became history, but the things that were true remained true. A man with dark eyes had seen a woman step off a train with fear in her face and had made a choice. A woman with brown hair and a forged letter had told the truth to the one person who had given her reason to. They had built something from that beginning, carefully and with full intention, every morning making the same choice that the first morning had initiated. Clement's law practice became, in the early years of the new century, one of the more respected in Wichita, not large, not prominent in the way of firms that handled the affairs of significant commercial interests, but consistently trustworthy and deeply invested in the specific cases of specific people who needed a clear mind and a committed advocate. He argued before the Kansas Supreme Court twice, both times in cases that centered on questions of evidentiary fairness and procedural justice, and won both times. He was not a man who collected victories as trophies. He filed them away as evidence of the ongoing possibility of the thing he believed in, which was that the law, properly understood and honestly applied, could be what it was supposed to be. Sadie's work with the commercial school continued until 1905, when the school expanded and she became its administrator, a role that suited her comprehensive organizational intelligence perfectly, and that she held with the same rigorous investment she had brought to everything from Martha Finch's accounts to the Caldwell School Board. She also continued to write when she had the time, not the urgent political accounts of the early years, but something more considered, pieces about the history of the places and people she had known, the particular character of life in a Kansas cattle town in its frontier years, the experience of women navigating that world with the tools available to them. Thomas was admitted to the engineering program at the University of Kansas in 1903, the first member of either family to attend university, and the day he left for Lawrence was one of the proudest and strangest of Clement and Sadie's parenting life. Standing on the station platform, watching their tall, quiet, serious son board a train into a future that was genuinely his own. Clara, at 19, had demonstrated herself to be entirely herself in ways that sometimes delighted and occasionally alarmed her parents. She had opinions about everything and the intellectual infrastructure to defend them, and she had begun writing for the Wichita Eagle, initially in the women's section and then, through the persistent and completely characteristic strategy of simply producing work that was too good to refuse, in the general news pages. She was going to be remarkable, and both her parents knew it, and she was young enough to still be finding out exactly what that meant. Hal, at 11, had resolved into a boy of enormous warmth and physical energy, and a particular talent for friendship. the kind of person around whom other people simply gathered, and he was currently the center of a neighborhood social ecosystem that Sadie found both charming and logistically demanding. On a November evening in 1905, exactly 22 years after their wedding, Clement came home from his office to find Sadie at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a letter in her hand, and the expression on her face was one he knew, the one she got when something had moved her more deeply than she was quite ready to deal with directly. "What is it?" he asked. She handed him the letter. It was from the Kansas Historical Society, responding to a formal submission Sadie had made of her written account of the events of 1883, the corruption case, the warrant, the choices made in Caldwell. The Society wished to include it in a collection they were compiling on the history of law and justice in territorial Kansas, to be held in their permanent collection and published in a volume the following year. "They want to preserve it," she said, formally, as history. He read the letter and set it down on the table and looked at her. "It is history," he said. "It is," she agreed. "All of it, even the parts that were terrible." She was quiet for a moment. "Especially the parts that were terrible, because those parts are the ones that make the rest of it matter." He sat down across from her at the kitchen table in the house on Maple Street in Wichita, Kansas, with the sound of Hal playing somewhere in the backyard and the winter dark coming down outside the windows, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "You were 24 years old and alone and frightened," he said, "and you never let it make you less than what you are." She turned her hand over and held his. "You were 30 years old and you read a telegram and made a choice based on 45 seconds of observation. Best 45 seconds of my life," he said. She laughed. The full, real laugh that she had first given in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel when the warrant was withdrawn, the unburdened kind. He watched her laugh and thought, as he had thought on that morning in Caldwell 22 years ago, that she was worth every risk and every consequence and every difficult choice, and that he would make the same choices again from the same first morning, without hesitation or amendment. They had dinner together that evening, the four of them who were currently home, Clement and Sadie and Clara and Hal, around the kitchen table with the good lamp lit, and the food hot, and the conversation going in four directions at once the way it always did with their family. And afterward Hal helped with the washing up with the particular theatrical martyrdom of an 11-year-old performing virtue, and Clara disappeared into her room with her notebook. And Clement and Sadie sat in the parlor in the two chairs that had migrated with them from Caldwell, reading in the quiet companionship they had cultivated for 22 years. At some point in the evening, without either of them marking the exact moment, Sadie looked up from her book and found Clement watching her, and his expression was the open, warm, fully unguarded one that she had first seen in a garden in August of 1883, the face he showed only to her, the one with no professional distance in it. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." He paused. "I was just thinking about the first morning." "You think about it often," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "Not with regret, never with regret, but I think about it because it was the morning everything I have now began, and I don't want to forget that." She set down her book. She looked at him across the parlor in the lamplight. This man who had made a choice on an April morning based on 45 seconds of observation and the deep, accurate instinct of a person of genuine character. And she thought about everything they had been through together, the fear and the secrets and the danger and the long, careful work of building something honest and lasting from a beginning made of concealment. "I knew too," she said. "That first morning, I knew I was going to trust you. I didn't know why yet, but I knew." "I know you did," he said. "How?" she asked with a small smile. "Because you told me the truth," he said. "In that garden you didn't have to. You could have kept hiding, but you told me everything because some part of you already knew I was safe." He held her gaze. "That was trust, Sadie, before you even knew it was." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "We have done well, haven't we, with all of it?" "We have," he said. "We have done very well." Outside the windows of the house on Maple Street, the November night was cold and clear and full of stars. Inside, the lamp burned steady. Clara's pen scratched in her room. Hal had gone to sleep. Thomas was 200 miles east, building things that would stand. The past was safely past, fully accounted for, all the dark chapters properly closed. Sadie got up from her chair and crossed the parlor to Clement's chair and sat beside him, fitting herself against his side with the ease of 22 years, and he put his arm around her and held her with the same complete intention he had always brought to holding things he cared about. "Every morning," she said. "Every single morning," he said. "Since the first one, until the last." The lamp burned on. The stars turned over Wichita. Outside, the century moved forward into everything that was coming, all the change and the loss, and the new things that would be built in the places where old things had been. But inside the house on Maple Street, in the chairs by the fire, there was a man and a woman who had found each other at the exact right moment and had not wasted it. And the thing between them was as sound and true and permanent as anything either of them had ever known. It had started on a first morning in April of 1883, on a train platform in a border town, when a man had seen a woman step off a train and had made a choice, and it had built from there, morning by morning, choice by choice, truth by truth, into something that would outlast all the fear and the secrets and the hard years and the long work. It would last every morning that came after. It would last forever.